One of the things that you get to do if you're with TMC is interact with some amazing people that we bring in, like Emma Green. Emma was with us since yesterday, and last evening with another colleague, Molly Worthen, did a very interesting session on political and religious polarization as a public health problem. Emma is a staff writer, as some of you will know, at the New Yorker, who covers education and academia. She was previously a staff writer at The Atlantic, where she covered religion and politics, and where she also served as managing editor. Her work has been anthologized in several books, including The American Crisis and The God Beat, and she's won a number of awards, including the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Excellence in Journalism, Arts, and Letters, and the Supple Award for Feature Writing from the Religion News Association. I will say personally that Emma's writing to me has been an exemplar of digging into areas of deep controversy publicly, including controversy within healthcare, and doing so in a way that does not caricature or flatten the humanity and the seriousness of the people engaged in these debates. She studies, and for example, and including religious people, but in a way that takes them as seriously as they take the subject matter that they're concerned in. And so she's been an exemplar, I will say personally, for me. And she's going to speak to us today with the title, Can We Live Together? The Crisis of Journalism in America. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much, Far, and thank you to everyone who has welcomed me so graciously to the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative here at Duke. And I'm just so happy to be here in North Carolina, and hopefully we'll get to meet with and talk with some of you after this in person. Thank you to everyone for joining here online. So today I am talking about this big question, can we live together? And how I see that related to the crisis in journalism. To just set the stage for what particular crisis I'm talking about, because there are many potential crises that one might talk about in journalism, I wanted to share a few stats with you that may be familiar in their overall tone and arc. So there was a survey that came out from Gallup in 2022 that suggested that among Americans, 38% have no trust whatsoever in the media to report fully, fairly, and accurately on stories that matter to them. Another 28% said that they don't have much trust in the media to report fully, fairly, and accurately. And then about 34% said they had a great deal or fair amount of trust. That is a bad landscape to be sitting here at my desk as a journalist and looking out at. That 2/3 of Americans don't really have that much trust in people like me who are in my line of work to do some of the basic tasks of our profession, to report things accurately, to report them with a fullness, to be able to see the full image, and to also to be fair, to give a fair hearing to multiple different perspectives. And those numbers are even more troubling when you dig a little bit deeper, and lots of organizations have come up with similar survey results. In this particular survey, the bifurcation of trust was acute along partisan lines. 70% of Democrats showed a great deal of trust, but only 14% of Republicans and 27% of independents, which just shows that the polarization that we're experiencing and that's talked about so much in our country very much falls on partisan lines when it comes to trust in the media. And then even more interestingly, among even those Democrats who showed a high degree of trust in the media, younger Democrats, only about 51% of them were willing to show that trust or show that great deal of trust, which suggests to me that the situation that we're in with a steep decline in trust in traditional media is only going to get worse. The way that younger people in the United States get their news, their media literacy, and in general, their desire to turn to the traditional sources of news, to journalists who practice with a certain type of ethical code and the tricks of our trade, that is decreasing as well. So we're in the middle of a sea change, but I don't think it's a sea change that is going to reverse direction. I think it's going to continue to escalate. when I think about why all of this is a problem, you could look at a lot of different aspects of that and identify the partisan polarization or the aspects of social media and technology. But to me, the real crisis, and this is the crisis that I was referring to when we were talking through the title of today's presentation, it's an epistemological pulling apart. It's an inability in our country for multiple people from different perspectives, walks of life, religious backgrounds, ethnic and racial backgrounds, to come together and share a fact universe, to agree on what is true about things that are happening in the world around us, and to even agree on how to determine what is true. How do we work our way towards facts and towards reality? That epistemological pulling apart, I think, has grave indications for the health of our democracy, our ability to come together once a year, once every other year at the polls and vote for people who will represent us in government, to respect the outcomes of those elections. It has grave implications for our ability to share a culture and a country, to believe that people who are neighbors in another town or another state who may be unlike us, nonetheless share something that is essential in terms of our values as Americans and our values of living together with one another in pluralism. And in the most alarmist moments, and we've seen some of this, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, there are indications that this epistemological pulling apart, this lack of shared fact universe, has grave implications for our ability to live peaceably with one another. And sometimes that shows up in talk of civil war, which I think is probably overly dramatic, but we see this in acts of violence, mass shootings, but also attacks on religious congregations. This sense that there's really no shared agreement of what it means to live peacefully and respectfully with our fellow Americans, I think has deep, deep roots in our inability to believe that we're living in the same reality. I think this crisis that I'm describing has really deep and fundamental connections to medicine. And I'm interested in getting some questions later on today from people in this conversation who are clinicians or in other ways practitioners who have seen some examples of this epistemological pulling apart, the inability to establish truth or fact through science. But I've done a lot of reporting over the last few years, as basically every journalist has, on the pandemic. And one thing that's been clear to me is that the pandemic has been an exacerbation of this pulling apart in medicine, our inability as a culture to trust medicine, to trust public health officials, and to come together in times of crisis to agree on the best path forward. So we can return to those themes later in today's discussion and certainly during the Q&A. So I've just laid out to you essentially why it's maybe a bad idea to be a journalist, or certainly a hopeless task to be in the line of work that I am. And I thought I would share just a little bit of brief background about my path through journalism and how I think about the work that I do. I am a staff writer at the New Yorker. I was previously at the Atlantic. And in all of the writing that I've done, I think I have largely circled around this question, the other part of the title of today's talk, which is, can we live together? I started out in journalism doing lots of things that were unrelated to writing, trying to manage the process of newsrooms, and had some opportunities to pitch stories on the side. And I found myself over and over again gravitating towards questions of religion. The first story I ever published for The Atlantic was actually about a group of nuns and their work behind the scenes on a big document that came out of Vatican II, the gathering of the Catholic Church in the 1960s, that had to do with Jewish Catholic relationships. And it only got more nerdy from there, nerdy in a good way, I hope. I continued to pitch religion stories and had a boss who encouraged me to develop that into a beat. And I came to understand, as I was writing about religion, that it was the best beat because it could be a doorway into basically any subject, stories about business, about culture, about politics, and also gave me access to people in some of the most intimate aspects of their life. Even if people who I was writing about weren't personally religious, religion illuminates the questions that I think everyone wrestles with in some way or another, and getting to talk with sources and write about their lives in those versions of those questions was just such an honor and so much fun. And as I continued to write about religion more, I came to think that the questions that were most interesting were questions that people were talking about with their friends and community members, not necessarily the questions that were teed up for them by their enemies. And these internal questions over belief and identity, the boundaries of community, changes in culture, I came to think of those as questions of, can we live together? Can we stay together in our church? Can we stay together in our denomination? Can we live together with our physical neighbors in the locality that we're living in? Can we negotiate differences even with people who we share a backyard with? Those questions, I think, speak directly into this epistemological crisis that I was describing earlier, because a big theme that comes up in my journalism over and over again, these can we live together questions, is our ability to see things in the same way, or to understand, at least empathetically, how somebody else might see them, and to recognize that there needs to be space for different ways of seeing the world within that church, within that denomination, within that neighborhood or locality. So when I have thought about challenges to the way that I do my work, these can we live together stories, and more broadly, the way that people in my line of work do their work, three big themes came up for me thinking about the way that this epistemological crisis affects the ability of journalists to do good work. These are crises of access, crises of literacy, and crises of scope. And again, I hope to draw connections throughout this to potentially ways that these issues come up in medicine as well. And I would love for people in this group to be reflecting on that as I share some of my thoughts on the way this challenges journalism. So in terms of crises of access, in a basic way, journalists, I think, have less access to places, spaces, and people than we have in previous times. This shows up in obvious ways. For example, in politics, it is now standard course for Republican candidates for office to shut off access for journalists, to not give interviews, to not hold press conferences, or to do so in ways that are quite limited, especially to partisan outlets. This has obvious implications for our politics and how journalists are able to do their jobs of actually explaining to readers what candidates for office think. But there are also all sorts of complicated ways that questions of access and a lack of trust, a lack of belief in the practice of journalism limit what journalists are able to do and create a downward spiral. So in general, I think a crisis of access is our inability as journalists to access that which isn't immediately visible, or to bring our readers to spaces that they normally wouldn't be in and help them to illuminate and understand those spaces better. One obvious example of this within the world of religion journalism, which I was in for a very long time and still kind of am, is access to conservative subcultures, conservative religious subcultures, where a lack of trust in media means that often people won't believe that a journalist is going to give them a fair shake, where they don't want a journalist in general to be present. They won't make people available for conversation. I had an experience like this reporting a number of years ago. I've reported a number of times on the March for Life, which gathers in DC every January around the anniversary of what was the Roe versus Wade decision. And, this is a pretty standard place for a religion journalist to go and do coverage, because abortion is a huge issue in a lot of religious communities. And I remember at a March for Life that was around the time of a big political debate with Trump and the new Supreme Court justices that were coming in, there was someone who I stopped to talk to on the street with my tape recorder and notebook. And he said, I bet you've never ever been to a March for Life before. I bet you've never interviewed a pro-life person before. And I bet you're just here to make fun of us, to caricature us, because all you journalists want to talk about is Trump and the people who voted for Trump and how foolish they are. And, I stopped in that moment and said, yeah, I'm not here to do that, tried to sort of give a polite explanation. But it really stuck with me because it was a very in-your-face example of the kind of mistrust that I see expressed online and in conservative media, certainly in conversations that I have with people all the time, which is a belief that journalists are just out to draw caricature, that they don't want to talk to journalists because they don't think that there's any chance that their beliefs or values will be portrayed in a way that they recognize. There are also lots of examples of access issues that I think have similar themes, but also cut in ways that are unexpected. So it's not just about journalists having trouble getting access to conservatives or conservative beliefs, but it's also about class, being able to reach communities that don't have slick press operations or who aren't necessarily part of really organized denominational structures. So I think about this a lot, for example, with charismatic Christian movements, which are often movements that are led by people of color. Sometimes they're movements that are led by people with less education and can often be very devolved from centralized organizing power. So storefront churches, for example, being able to see those communities well as journalists, and also to have the trust to be able to go into those communities and be able to understand them and have the goodwill of the people that are there, I think is another huge challenge for journalists and journalists like me who cover and take seriously religion. There's a clear connection in my mind here to medicine in the sense that one of the great hobbles for medicine during the pandemic, for example, public health, was the ability to communicate facts about COVID-19 and the way that people could protect themselves, and also to get people to sign on to doing basic practices to protect themselves and others, and then also to come in for basic treatment, for example, to receive vaccines. The anti-vax movement is one that gets a lot of coverage in the religion journalism world and has relevance for the world of medicine as well. So that inability to access populations that are most in need of medical information and most in need of medical support and treatment, I think that has some of these similar shared themes of barriers that journalists might face. The second great crisis or challenge that came to mind for me was a crisis of literacy. And this is something that comes up a lot in the world of religion journalism coverage, but I think has much broader implications beyond the religion beat of journalists being unable to speak the native language of groups that they might want to cover and facing an inability to either communicate with them well or to capture a story well and tell it well. Within the religion journalism world, it's something of a, I don't want to call it, pastime over beers, but maybe it is, to talk about some of the errors that have been made that are a little more humorous or comical about religious illiteracy. So for example, a few years ago, the Wall Street Journal wrote a story that was about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel and a speech that he gave. And he was giving an example about getting water from a rock, which is, for those of you who know your Bible, something that comes up in the Hebrew Bible. Moses trying to tap a rock and get water from a rock when the people of Israel are in the desert. But the journalist wrote it as getting water from Iraq, the country in the Middle East. So, Iraq, that got corrected. Or another example that came up a few years ago when the Notre Dame caught fire in Paris and a priest rushed to save a crown of thorns And what he told the reporter was the body of Jesus. And so the reporter translated that as a statue of Jesus that the priest was saving. But of course, that wasn't what he was referring to. He was referring to the Blessed Sacrament, the body of Christ. Those are sort of funny examples that can get a laugh, and, people sort of trade around and say, oh, thank goodness that wasn't us making such a dumb error. But this can have real deep and important consequences when journalists don't know the basic facts about religious groups or in general groups that they are trying to cover. In the world of religion, I think this happens egregiously when journalists are covering Muslims, for example. Lots of basic illiteracy about the percentage of the population that American Muslims are, the racial diversity within the American Muslim population, certainly the diversity of belief and practice, and the kinds of traditions that are followed within the American Muslim world and the Muslims around the globe. And this can happen too in big stories that have real national significance. I, as a journalist during the Trump years, was asked over and over again by my editors to make sense of white evangelicals. This was the group and the phrase that was on everyone's lips after President Trump was elected in 2016. The stat that went around was that 81% of white evangelicals had helped Trump to get elected. And I was asked over and over again to sort of puzzle out, who were these people? What did they want? Why did they vote for Trump? Wasn't it contradictory that they voted for Trump? And, I tried to do this to the best of my ability to bring nuance, to steward a diversity of perspectives. But I found that there was a basic barrier when I would try to explain stories to editors, or when I was reading coverage from people who weren't specialists in the religion beat, which is people couldn't really even define what an evangelical is. And of course, that's a contested word. It's a complicated term that even people who would consider themselves to be part of that world might feel some hesitation about. But basic definitions about, for example, views on salvation, views on the centrality of the Bible, views on conversion and the importance of a conversion experience to people's religious identity. These were aspects of what it means to be an evangelical that I found a lot of people in the press weren't that acquainted with. And so there was a real gap that had to be filled there in trying to educate people and get them acquainted with the basic terms of what they were talking about. So those are really specific examples from the world of religion journalism. But I do think, again, there's a broader connection here to medicine and some of the issues that doctors might face, especially, and this has come up for a long time around cultural sensitivity towards, for example, religious objectors, or language facility with populations that may not be able to communicate in English, or a basic level of trust. I'll share a story that I worked on a couple of years ago that gets into some of these issues in medicine about a man who was part of an ultra-Orthodox or Haredi population in Brooklyn, a Hasidic population in Brooklyn, who, as the editor of a Yiddish language publication, challenged his community on why there were so few COVID safety practices that he saw within synagogues and among the leaders of his community. And it was a pretty remarkable thing for him to publish that kind of open challenge in his Yiddish language journal. But as I was interviewing this man who went by the pseudonym of Reuven, other aspects came to mind for me of the challenges of trying to reach that population and help people to not get as sick and to avoid preventable death. And, in New York City, I think this is a real healthcare challenge. Medical practitioners trying to reach people who live in multi-generational homes, who often live in poverty, who don't necessarily trust doctors, and especially non-Jewish doctors, clinicians not being able to communicate with people in Yiddish, even if Yiddish is their first language, if English isn't a very good language for them, or a language they have much faculty with. So, during the pandemic, this was an acute issue, and one that I thought about a lot in terms of all of the different factors that went into that population suffering disproportionately, especially during the early phases of the pandemic, from severe illness and death. The final challenge that I have been reflecting on as I've been thinking about this great crisis in journalism and the epistemological pulling apart, is a question of scope. And what I mean by scope is the terrain in public life that journalists, especially at national mainstream outlets, believe is fair game for entertaining multiple perspectives. I think about this a lot because my stories about Can We Live Together often deal with trying to reconcile or understand multiple different perspectives that are often irreconcilable. And in many cases, because I cover issues that are quite controversial, my stories can involve points of view that some people would believe are abhorrent, are immoral, a miscarriage of justice, and should not be entertained or enabled or given a platform. And I think this is a live debate within journalism that there are many, many different viewpoints on about the expansiveness of our coverage and the kinds of views that should be given credence or dignity. I think this reflects a broader cultural problem, just as a side note, that we haven't resolved as a culture what views are worthy of dignifying versus what views should be marginalized and sent to the dustbin of history. There are some cases that I think are easy cases, or that the vast majority of Americans, and certainly the vast majority of journalists, would agree on, which is, for example, someone who's an avowed white supremacist shouldn't be. Maybe we should try to understand them or write about them in a way that's clear and accurate, but certainly we shouldn't entertain that their viewpoints are ones that are deserving of our respect. And certainly as journalists, it's really important to catalog the harms that those viewpoints have brought. But as you move towards issues that are more hotly contested, more at the center of public life today, I think it becomes much less easy to bang the gavel so firmly and say, this is a person whose viewpoint we shouldn't entertain or give dignity to, we shouldn't give respect to. So to give an example of a very recent controversy over an issue in the media that's come up quite a bit in my coverage, talking about specifically transgender people and the way that physicians should offer them care, and even more specifically, transgender youth and the way that clinicians should talk to their families, talk to those young people, and offer them paths forward when they experience gender dysphoria or in other ways are looking to be affirmed in a new gender. The reason I'm bringing this up is because earlier this week, there were 2 letters that were sent to the New York Times, one by GLAAD, which is an LGBTQ advocacy organization, and a number of other advocacy organizations that work in that space, and another letter that was sent by New York Times contributors and journalists. And the basic thrust of both of these letters was that recent coverage that had been done by the New York Times, and in some cases by the New York Times's top journalists, not opinion writers, but reporters who had a lot of experience trying to navigate really tender issues, was transphobic and helped to perpetuate bigotry and stereotype. It put transgender youth in danger and was part of a long history that has been well documented of the New York Times covering in past eras gay people with derision or suspicion in a way that brought them clear harm. A couple of examples that came up were stories, for example, that ran in the New York Times Magazine, one by Emily Bazelon, that was about a debate within the world of medicine over the right way to treat transgender youth who present to doctors and wish for a path forward through medical means. And another story was about another journalist named Katie Baker about students socially transitioning in their school context, but parents being kept in the dark, parents not being informed by the schools that this was happening, and the kind of discombobulation that parents felt about that, or the sense of internal dilemma that parents felt about that. Both of these instances were name checked in this letter that came from New York Times contributors to the New York Times Standards editor. And to me, this is a really interesting moment because I certainly was not involved in that, and I don't have anything to do with it. But, as a journalist, when I'm looking at my own colleagues at large, people within my guild who do my same profession, wrestling with this, that was a moment of internal advocacy by a set of journalists who believed that on this particular issue, their peers had not done a respectful job and were doing harm. And moreover, that their peers were doing work that's being levied and used in political contexts around the country that can harm people, that can harm transgender youth, which I don't think at all was the intention of any of the New York Times journalists who worked on those stories. Looking at this internal debate within the world of journalism over the scope of questions that we can cover, the scope of challenges and perspectives that should be integrated into a story and treated seriously and with dignity, that to me felt like a wake-up call and a series of ongoing wake-up calls about our unsettledness within our own profession over what kind of truth we tell and whose perspective should factor into that, and how we establish even what that truth and reality and factual evidence is. Clearly, more than any of the other examples that I've given, this has a strong connection to the world of medicine, because these questions are also unsettled within the world of medicine. And certainly, I think there's lively debate within the clinical world over treatment options for transgender youth and all sorts of questions that are adjacent to it. But I think it's also unclear the extent to which those debates can happen and even be treated as debates, because the stakes seem so high, the stakes of people's mental health, the stakes of the mental health of young people. It's very hard to treat that in a sort of academic, intellectual sense. And I think that sense of stakes is something that journalists and clinicians have to wrestle with alike. So these three big challenges, access, literacy, and scope, that all touch in some way on this epistemological crisis that I've been talking about. The result of all of this is a crisis of readership. We know from those stats that I shared at the beginning of this talk that a lot of readers don't trust journalists to tell stories in ways that they can rely on or believe to be true. And we see that in the bifurcation of who comes to read the Washington Post, the New York Times, publications like mine, the New Yorker. There are structural reasons for the crisis of readership that go beyond this epistemological challenge that I've been describing. The collapse of local news has been horrible for journalism, both as a profession, but also for giving people basic facts about things that are going on in their communities and in their state. And that's an ongoing collapse for which I don't know what the solution will be. I don't think anybody has come up with a great solution for local and regional journalism. And there are also some more malignant or nefarious causes of this crisis of readership and crisis of trust among readers. Right-wing media, for example, for decades has been cultivating a sense of distrust in the mainstream media. Talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, this is a standard play, and academics have done lots of great research on this, deploying that sense of distrust and trying to undermine the trust of listeners and viewers and readers in mainstream media. I think it's been a field that's sown with seeds and has had great fruit in terms of undermining trust and making journalists persona non grata in certain conservative circles. But in some ways, even though I think it's important to acknowledge those kinds of challenges for journalism and for journalists, I am one to think that it's more productive to introspect, to look at what we do not so well, the way that we sometimes don't steward people's trust, the way that we sometimes tell stories in ways that are flat or unnuanced, that don't show a diversity within certain movements or on certain issues, that can leave people feeling that their basic beliefs and convictions aren't being reflected in a universe that they recognize. So for me as a journalist, in my limited ability as one person, a drop in the bucket in the universe of media coverage, I try to steward people's trust by writing stories that they recognize. People don't always agree with the stories that I write. They certainly don't agree necessarily with the people who oppose them, who I also try to treat fairly in my stories. But my goal is always to paint a universe that people recognize as their own. They say, yes, I basically think that you've captured the landscape that we occupy. You've captured the range of debate, even if I don't agree fully with the way that you've written it. I try to be knowledgeable to the best of my ability. It can be a humbling thing, especially in something like the religion beat, where the knowledge that you can have could just fill buckets and buckets and buckets, PhDs, many, many PhDs worth of knowledge, to have to be able to go to different communities and be fluent and understand the basic facts of what people believe, their sacred texts, how they practice. That's really humbling. I think it's humbling too. I'm in a new job at the New Yorker, relatively new job covering higher education, where some of these questions I think are very similar, the can we live together questions. But the amount that I don't know about higher education could fill books. So it's a humbling thing as a journalist to be a generalist and have to come to situations and ask dumb questions. But I also think it's really important for journalists to try to honor people by understanding them as well as they can, to ask those dumb questions in an effort to be more fully literate and to understand, and to just have an openness to reframing the way that we receive information from people and receive information about people's beliefs and lives, and to portray them in a way that hopefully they recognize and find as fair. And finally, I try to be expansive, and this speaks to the question of scope that I was talking about earlier. When I'm writing a story or thinking about a story I might potentially want to write, I try to have an expansive view on who can be included and what can be included, and who's worthy of treating with dignity. Because in general, I think most all people deserve being treated with dignity. And I think that can be reflected in journalism. I think a similar ethos certainly could be present in medicine, that all people are worthy of being treated fairly and with dignity, and that their health is something that should be respected. I don't have much hope to offer. Usually a talk that is pegged to crisis and challenge and has those sorts of hair on fire words you would hope would end on an up note. And I'm not sure I have a clear one to offer to you, other than I believe that journalism will continue to matter. And I believe that even though there are many, many structural challenges, and we are in a time of polarization, which is very, very difficult to understand our way out of or find a path out of, that it's worth doing the work. It's worth trying to write stories fairly. I think when I get feedback on my work, I think the most powerful and meaningful feedback I can get is somebody saying, I understood this in a new way, or I encountered an idea that I had never encountered before, and maybe I understand it a little bit better, and I see it. That understanding, I have to hope, in order to get out of bed every morning and do my work, I have to hope that little glimmer of understanding that I can offer in my teeny tiny way as one single person can help in some way with this big, vast, intractable issue that we're dealing with, of a non-shared fact universe and a very polarized society. I think it's really important to do that work in whatever our respective vocations are, because in the end, it's how we can live together, the only hope that we have to be able to live together. But the jury is still out on that question of, can we live together after all? So thank you again for having me here, and I look forward very much to your questions.
Thank you, Emma. A lot to dig into here. Let me start with a question, and as I ask that, I'll mention to the rest of you, if you have a question, if you can just put up your little, under the reactions tab, raise your hand, then I'll call on you, or you can send the question through the chat feature. But you mentioned early on in the talk that the challenge of an epistemological pulling apart, where we struggle across differences to even come up with shared facts. I think of it as some philosophers have pointed out, the challenge of actually having an argument. In order to have an argument, you have to have some shared basis of facts that you take for granted, and certain assumptions you take for granted. Otherwise, you're just lobbing sort of verbal assaults at one another. When you want to understand some area of dispute, let's just say it's something like what's the right kind of regulation of abortion post Dobbs, or what's the right way to think about gender affirmation procedures, so-called, or whether Duke employees and undergrads should be required to get another vaccine booster. And there are going to be some deep feelings and smart people on different sides of this. How do you discern the shared facts? I mean, how do you go about, I guess, talking to folks in a way that you find them a resource for getting clarity yourself about not necessarily what the right conclusions are about what we ought to do, but what are the facts that seem to matter here?
So I think a lot about the distinction between fact questions and value questions, normative claims versus factual claims. And on a topic like abortion, I think that is very vexed. All of the examples that you gave, that's a very vexed question. Because often, especially in the world of advocacy, facts are rallied by advocates on both sides as a sort of airtight case to support their normative claims, their worldview about what is right or what is just. And it can be very difficult to find the water's edge of what is scientific evidence that we can see and understand through survey data, through experiments that have happened, and what is actually a conclusion or an interpretation or a layering onto that scientific evidence or that scientific claim. So in the abortion debate, I think it's really important for reporters to try to take seriously what role science can play in helping us to understand the experience of pregnancy, to understand the experience of fetal life, to understand, for example, advances in medicine and how that may be important for impacting how we think about policies on, the right restrictions on abortion and what period of pregnancy that happens. I think it's really important to try to be fluent in that and to be literate in what kinds of experts can offer credible testimony, to understand the way that advocates use that information and maybe step back from that a little bit. And I think this is true on both sides. And also in the abortion debate specifically, something that I've thought about a lot that's changing a little bit, but is still pretty much true, is that for many, many years, those who believe in abortion rights have had a monopoly on facts. Even people who operate in pro-life circles will often point to the Guttmacher Institute, for example, for their data on abortion statistics, and the Guttmacher Institute is openly pro-choice. So that too is something to be really attentive to as a journalist, right? Why is it that the fact universe is monopolized by people who share a certain point of view, and how might that even shape the facts that they're offering? So just, I think maybe the short answer to your question is real critical thinking, real willingness to be skeptical of things that are presented in a facty form, but also an appreciation of the way that scientific evidence or data can really importantly shape a debate, and being willing to entertain that and be fluent in it, and then stop, find the water's edge where that limit is, and bring it into a normative space and be really open in the normative space about understanding that people have different beliefs and trying to engage with those openly and fairly, even if they aren't scientific beliefs, right? Giving credence to those, even if they are not beliefs that can be proven by science.
We have a question from Susan Bain. Susan, you could go ahead and unmute if you would. Go ahead.
Yeah. Emma, thank you so much for coming. I learned a lot. So I am a graduate of the TMC hybrid program last year, and I'm an obstetrician and gynecologist. And you asked us to think about how these challenges, affect us in medicine. And what really resonated to me was the lack of access to what has been for over 20 years, my very own medical organization, the American College of OBGYN. And this is the first year I didn't renew my membership. And I am now a member of APLOG, which is American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, because I think the crisis that I found as it relates to our professional organization is a crisis in just the value of scholarly debate. And it's been very much shut down if the leaders of our organizations don't necessarily have the same thoughts as we do or want to ask questions. I've also found there's this crisis of guidance for practitioners like myself who for years have looked to these organizations to give me practice guidelines and committee opinions. And then I think the last thing is it's a crisis in this next generation of medical students and residents as to where do they look for their answers and the teaching that they get. But I'll end it on my comment on, I do think there's hope. I was at the APLOG National Conference last week, and there were 70 medical students there who were really trying to understand, and many of the stories I heard, they're navigating some pretty tough situations in their med schools to just be heard and respected. So I appreciate your insight today.
That's so interesting. And I'll just say, Susan, as a plug for my own work, I wrote a story that came out last spring, summer, that was about exactly the issue that you're describing, which was the way in which specifically the abortion landscape that's changing, the end of Roe would change the culture within medical training for residents who are going into obstetrics. And it got into some of the questions that you're talking about, which is, a lack of representation, an inability to have those conversations in some cases, how people deal with accommodations across a wide spectrum of conscience objections. So anyways, you should check out the story.
Yeah, that, Emma, leads to a question I had of that flows out of also your description of the colleagues at the New York Times whose writing elicited kind of joint letters by organizations suggesting that they'd harmed, it sounds like, harmed others through their writing. And that is my sense is from talking to members of ACOG over the years who are members who do not agree with ACOG's policies, is a sense that if you particularly if you're in leadership, if you put your head out, you act like there's a serious debate about one of these issues, there's going to be significant cost to that. And obviously, I'm thinking about your coworkers and the cost that they face. So you have the issue of the allegation that an issue has such high stakes that you can't write about it in a way that is not supportive of a particular conclusion. And then you have the issue of people seeing that there's a high social cost or risk involved in questioning something. How do you, what do we do in the face of that?
Well, I can only answer that from the perspective of a journalist, although of course that kind of dilemma that you're describing applies to a lot of different people. And certainly I can imagine situations where it might apply to a clinician. As a journalist, I would say a couple of things. I have certainly faced pushback on things that I have written, nothing that has risen to the level of, a 1,200 person signed letter of protest, some of whom were my colleagues, to my editors about something I wrote. I mean, that's pretty intense as a form of social cost and social calling out. But, I've written stories before that have gotten a lot of pushback on social media, certainly that have brought in a lot of criticism by email, although I love email criticism because it's often the thoughtful people who take the time to write an email criticism, not always, but most of the time. And I think it's really important for journalists to cultivate a healthy sense of apathy towards people who don't want to engage with them seriously, but rather want to shut them down. And, I'm trying to use the right combination of words, because I think journalists, it's so important to be humble and open to criticism and open to getting better. They say first draft of history for a reason, which is there's always this revision process. And I think it's really important for journalists to be doing that self-revision process and self-reflection process. So it's not to be shutting out criticism, but what you're describing, Far, is something different, which is a desire to shut down certain avenues of inquiry, or to label journalists as doing harm or being themselves bigoted or discriminatory if they entertain certain points of view or entertain certain questions. And, journalism is a constant exercise of judgment. That's the entire practice of journalism, is just judgment. And so people's judgment will fall down in different places about where those lines should be drawn. But I think it's really important that if a journalist believes and tries very hard to do work that is fair and caring and sensitive, that is humane and offers people dignity, that is done in consultation with their editors, and that is done with a high degree of scrutiny in terms of meeting a bar of quality and having done the practice of journalism well. If a journalist is doing that, I think it's really important to stay the course and to be able to shut out some of the screaming if people don't like it, because, we live in a time when, and I want to be sort of deft in how I say this, but we live in a time when mechanisms of social shaming or trying to sort of steward conversation in one direction or another are very powerful and powerfully felt. And I think it's sort of antithetical to the practice of journalism to care too much about that, because journalists are supposed to be fearless in the pursuit of the truth, and humble, certainly while they're doing that, but fearless.
Yeah, it seems to me one might say that medical practitioners likewise should be fearless in pursuit of their patient's health as best they can understand it. Though also within medicine, you have different parallels of the same kind of worry that a journalist would have if they're raising a question about, or even just writing a story in which some people are raising a question about some practice, a worry that they would suffer a social cost that just is not worth it. We had a question, Emma, of recognizing there's kind of, one can imagine two approaches to journalism, one in which the journalist is two approaches that have integrity, one in which the journalist is trying to clarify the truth of the matter as best they can. There's some phenomenon, some debate, trying to lay out the facts as best they can. And another approach being a journalist trying to find interesting minority voices or challenging voices to what most people tend to take to be the case, and maybe even the journalist his or herself that take to be the case, in order to foster more informed, thought, and let people's ideas be challenged, let them make their own judgments. What do you think what do you think about those two approaches?
I don't think they even have to be two approaches that diverge too much. I think the answer partially depends on the perch that you're talking about for the journalist or the kind of journalism that they're doing. So for me at the New Yorker, my job, I would say, is twofold, and this tension will reflect the two paths that you've just laid out. The first is to take big swings at really meaty conflicts and topics and questions and give people, as best as I can, a good faith rendition of the complications and the different perspectives and why something is such a meaty, challenging question. But I also have a mandate as a reporter at the New Yorker to find new and novel characters and people who will be surprising and stories that we haven't heard before. And that, I think, can work with the first, but it sort of adds this heightened level to find something that is new or surprising. I think similarly with the two paths that you're describing, which is, on the one hand, sort of finding the representative points on the constellation around a question, and then on the other hand, finding people who are sort of like minority or don't get that much airing of their public view. I think they can go together really nicely. I just always think it's really important when I'm thinking about who should be a character in a piece or a spokesperson for something, that first, there are people who operate in good faith, because there are a lot of people who don't operate in good faith. I'm not that interested in those people personally. I think it's much more fulfilling and satisfying to try to talk with people and engage with people who really believe what they're saying and have stakes and live it out in some way. So good faith is really important. And the second is to be clear in my own head on behalf of my readers what it is that I'm trying to achieve when I am lifting up the voice of someone whose perspective isn't often heard, or trying to find a surprising story that's off the beaten path. You can do that for its own sake as an exercise, but I think it's really important to be clear, what am I trying to help people understand better? What am I trying to eliminate? Is there a challenge in someone's life that they might be able to think about differently because they read my story? Is there a public issue that gets talked about a lot that a reframing with this new and novel character can help people to sort of rejigger the way that they're approaching it? So, it's a lot of questions of judgment, but I don't think the two have to be mutually exclusive.
It strikes me that there's no way around judgment, good judgment, practical wisdom, some virtues of taking people seriously, respect, a genuine desire to discern the truth, not just to win an argument. I mean, it seems like those are things that even also for journalists are critically important to do their work well. We have come to the end of our hour. Thank you, Emma, very much. I again commend those who are on this or are looking at this later, if you're seeing the recording, to look up some of Emma Green's work. It will, I think, encourage you about the kind of journalism that's possible, that takes seriously people on different sides of very serious debates, including debates that Christians have been involved in one way or another.